Hello, I'm Ambassador Alan Katz, and I'm here with a group of students who have helped plan the next program at American Public Square, and we're going to have a conversation about it right now. Okay, I want to welcome you all here, and I think that what you've accomplished in putting this program together is outstanding. But I have some questions for you, and I'd like to hear what you have to say. The first one is, and Piper, let's start with you. Why was this topic chosen of all the things going on in the world? Why would you sort of settle on a topic that we at American Public Square, quite frankly, have avoided for the last 9 years?
I think with the recent Roe v. Wade decision in the Supreme Court, that will have really lasting ramifications on our generation, especially we don't know what it's going to look like in 10 years regarding laws and the Constitution affecting abortion. So I think that's really what impacted me and a lot of my classmates to decide on abortion as our topic.
Okay, Raul?
I think the reason that I was drawn to this topic is because when you talk about wicked topics and polarizing topics, abortion is one of the most polarizing issues. It has two opposite sides. There's not really any middle ground. And I think if you're going to want to really bring people together and have a discussion, you go big.
Okay, so you all have been part of the Civics Education Initiative. Is there something in particular that you learned from this process? Reggie?
I was very happy to be in this process because when Ms. Maxfield came to our school, she was very inviting, and she made us learn how to speak to people and have disagreements with people in a different way.
Oh, good. Jade, what about you?
Fact-checking for sure, especially on social media with lateral reading. I don't know if you guys have heard about the whole Trump being arrested. They posted a whole bunch of photos on social media about it, and I definitely caught my eye. So I clicked on it, and then I actually read and Googled and looked up different websites, and I was able to see that it was AI that had created the images.
How about you, Raul?
I think where I really applied what I learned in APS is online discussions, because I don't know about you guys, but when I see someone say something online that I know is not true or I disagree with, I tend to get an argument. I think what's really important with that is that you, especially when it's online, you kind of forget the other person on the other side is a person. They have their own life. They have reasons why they believe this.
Piper, what do you hope the audience gets out of this, all the work you all have put into this?
I really hope that people realize not everything has simple one-answer solutions. There's this is a very broad topic, and not every person is going to be satisfied with the solution that that people decide upon. And it's important to realize you have to be okay with not getting everything that you might think is right.
Lynn?
For the audience, if they don't gain anything about the actual topic, if they could gain on watching people with different viewpoints deliberating with each other and not arguing with each other and not going at each other's throats and just trying to understand and have a productive discussion, I think that'll A, help educate them on the topic more, but B, they could possibly use that in their own life.
Okay, so what can we learn, people of my generation? What do you have to teach us? What have you observed in your lives? Both, including, by the way, things we're doing wrong. That's part of all of that too. But what is it that you see that you think we could learn from you?
That change is coming. Change happens every day with this generation as a whole, and I see a lot of older people shun us for changing and adapting to the new ideas of the world today.
Let me thank you all. I will end with two quick notes. Number one, and Reggie in particular, when you talked about change, I grew up in the 60s. There was a time there was a lot of change, and we were not appreciated by people of my generation now, in terms of what we did. But the most important lesson I ever learned was that for every complicated problem, there's always a simple answer, and it's always wrong. So I appreciate the fact that you all are looking at all sides of this, and appreciate you being here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Alan Katz, the American Public Square at Jewel founder, and we at American Public Square are delighted to see you all for tonight's panel, Life and Legislation, America's Big Divide on Abortion. The program has been produced by the high school students participating in our Civics Education Initiative, some of whom you saw on the film clip a few moments ago, and it is the culmination of our student programming for the academic year. Candidly, as I mentioned in that little bit, we have avoided for 9 years doing very much with this topic. However, one feature of our student curriculum is that it is student-led. And we feel strongly about giving our student ambassadors a voice in the year-long project-based learning experience, and it was they who decided that this was the topic that needed to be discussed. We hope that the students program will be a model to encourage more of us to engage in civil dialogue about reproductive rights and other polarizing topics so that we may work together to build a less contentious, safer, and a more productive society. Now, there is no question that all of us hold very different views on this topic, as does the broader APS community. This program is a chance for us to come together, look beyond our closely held positions for the evening, hear different perspectives, seek to understand better why others believe what they believe, and begin to navigate a path forward for the students in the room and for those to come. And we know that everyone here is aware of APS's commitment to creating a safe space for divergent opinions. Everyone here will find some opinions from the panelists tonight that you disagree with. You will all hear something from one of the panelists that you agree with. And we want you to be able to express yourself. So consequently, if you hear something that you agree with, please do this. And if you find something you disagree with, do this. And that way the conversation can continue, questions can be asked, and answers can be given. I think that I know I can count on all of you here to join our students in a civil yet vigorous conversation. And now let me turn this over to the person who has coordinated this for American Public Square, Tricia Maxfield.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to everybody who's joined us here this evening. Before we begin the conversation in earnest, I want to recognize the schools and the educators who have made the Civics Education Initiative possible this year. Without them and their answering of many emails, we would not be gathered here this evening. After I've read all their names, please join me in a big round of applause for these excellent educators. And teachers, would you stand? Please. Leah Edens from University Academy, Joni Harrell from Belton, Mary Humphreys and Nicole Cusick from Lee Summit West, Amanda Polking from Shawnee Mission North, Brent Schulte from Olathe North, Keith Schoen and Ashlyn Welch from Guadalupe Centers High School. Go teachers! Teacher Appreciation Week is coming up, first week in May. To our student ambassadors, you are simply amazing. We hope this has ignited a desire to participate fully in your communities, and that by deliberating the most pressing problems in society, you will indeed become the practiced problem solvers of tomorrow. It should be noted, our student ambassadors arrived at this topic from varying places. Like us, they hold a range of positions and life experiences. Yet through the course of their collaboration designing tonight's event, they voiced and listened to divergent opinions. They did this in order to foster better understanding across competing perspectives, all important elements of a healthy democracy. In recognition of their work, each student ambassador has earned a certificate of completion for the year and a student membership to American Public Square. Great job, students. On behalf of our students, I will speak for them. They invite you to our public square this evening, not to change your mind, but rather to open it. Frank and factual dialogue can often make us more firm in our own perspective, but with a better understanding of the whole issue, and we hope without the rhetoric. They encourage all of us to participate in civil dialogue about abortion and other polarizing topics in an effort to build a more compassionate and civil society. With that, I'll turn it over to our student ambassadors.
John Stuart Mill is known to have said, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." Bill Nye, the science guy, once said, "Everyone you will ever meet knows something you don't." On behalf of all the APS student ambassadors, I welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight's program is a culmination of our work together over the course of this school year. We want to thank our parents, teachers, and school administrators whose trust and cooperation and support has made our participation possible.
As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome questions and fact checks from the audience. For our audience members in person, you will see question and fact check cards around the auditorium. This is what they look like. When you have a question or a fact check, please write it on the sheet and hold it up. A student volunteer will come by and collect it for our roving reporter. Tonight's roving reporter is Hannah Wise with the Kansas City Star. For those of you watching virtually, please type your questions or fact checks in the chat. Please note, we will likely not have time to ask the panel all the questions the live and virtual audiences will ask. Our roving reporter and a team will do their best to identify themes. Also, questions posed to the panel will be confined to the program topic. However, all questions will be provided to the panelists after the program, and APS will use them to produce a follow-up podcast program, so stay tuned. Tonight's fact sheet and fact checkers were made possible by the William T. Kemper Foundation. Kate Nolan, attorney and con law adjunct professor at William Jewell, is our fact checker for this evening, supported by student volunteers.
At American Public Square, we rely on our civility toolkit to keep our conversation on track and civil. Please take a moment to review the toolkit featured here, along with the fact sheet. Several members of the audience, as well as our moderator, have civility bells. These will be rung if the tone of conversation becomes less than civil and needs to redirect. Finally, in the interest of keeping the conversation flowing and of course civil, we ask that you please not clap during the panel discussion. It is now my privilege to introduce our moderator for this evening, Meg Cunningham, Missouri Statehouse reporter for the Kansas City Beacon.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. We are set to have a great discussion tonight and cover lots of different facets of this topic. As we've already heard before, we're really here to promote the work that the students have done throughout the course of the year and really explore this topic. We have lots of great perspectives up here tonight to share, and we're going to have a great discussion. So down here at the end, we have Rabbi Doug Alpert. He is the spiritual leader of Congregation Kolami in Kansas City. Right next to him is John Carney. John recently retired as the CEO of the Practical Center for Bioethics after having served there for 11 years. And then next to John, we have Kansas Attorney General Kris Kobach. To his left, we have Dr. Megan Madrigal, a practicing obstetrician and gynecologist at University Health Truman Medical Center. Next, we have Ms. Gloria Purvis, host and executive producer of the Gloria Purvis podcast from America Media. And then finally, we have Professor of Economics from the University of Kansas, David Slusky. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. So let's jump right into it. Attorney General Kobach, I'd like to pose the first question to you. With the Supreme Court's latest ruling to leave mifepristone on the shelves and send this issue back to the lower courts, where do things go from here from a legal perspective? And does it matter what Americans feel about banning medical abortions with the majority of the country opposed to that measure?
I guess to answer the question, I should probably start with a little bit of where Dobbs came from and then talk about the mifepristone recent ruling on the preliminary injunction. So the And before I talk about Dobbs, I should mention, the constitutional premise that Dobbs is based on. So I used to teach constitutional law at UMKC for 15 years, just half a mile from here. And one of the things we start with is the remembering what a constitution is all about, and that is that constitutional rights are only those rights that we all or nearly all agree on, regardless of our political view. That no matter what our party or what faction we are in, as James Madison would have said, that we all agree on certain principles. So we all agree here that we have the right to peaceably assemble as we have, and we have the right to speak as we are doing, and we have the right to worship freely, whatever our choice of religion is, or no religion at all. But then that those are things we would all agree on, or probably 90% of us would, and those are the constitutional principles. And then everything else, the subjects on which we disagree, are subjects where legislatures can deliberate and debate. And the Roe opinion attempted to elevate the issue of abortion to a constitutional right. And the difficulty that Roe had all along was that the word abortion doesn't appear in the Constitution, and the word privacy doesn't appear in the Constitution. So there was always this uneasiness of how long it would last as a constitution at that elevated constitutional level. Dobbs came along, and the Supreme Court said, the original reasoning wasn't there. We the people, a supermajority, had never elevated it to that level, and brought it back down to the normal statutory debate, which, to answer your question now, that's where it remains. And it remains at the statutory level where we can elect our representatives. And just to quote a couple sentences from Dobbs, "It is time to heed the Constitution and return the issue of abortion to the people's elected representatives. The permissibility of abortion and the limitations upon it are to be resolved, like most important questions in our democracy, by citizens trying to persuade one another and then voting." So that's what the Supreme Court did, pushed it back to the state legislatures, and it is a truly divisive question. Indeed, the title of this is The Great Divide that we're talking about. And the specific case that the Supreme Court just ruled on was a preliminary injunction that had been issued by a district judge in Texas over the FDA's approval of this abortion pill, mifepristone, and basically saying that the preliminary injunction shall not remain in effect. It essentially stayed that preliminary injunction while the case proceeds through the lower courts, and eventually the case will come right back to the Supreme Court. So that's where it stands. Now, the mifepristone case is not a constitutional case. It's a statutory one. It's back down at that statutory level, where it's a question of whether the FDA exceeded its authority and properly went through and checked all of the statutory boxes in approving the drug. So I think most of the cases we will see, certainly in the federal courts, are going to be statutory cases, not the grand constitutional question, but whether an agency followed the statute.
Thank you. John, I want to come to you now. From the bioethics perspective, what could a ruling potentially taking mifepristone off the shelves look like?
I think the biggest concern that those of us in healthcare, and that's the kind of the angle we take at the Center for Practical Bioethics, is really more around healthcare, is that the precedent that was set and the rules that apply to the FDA are not necessarily sacrosanct, but we depend on those in our ability to operate as practitioners, to deliver care, to perform our duties and obligations that we have to our patients and families. And the kind of upheaval that obviously has already taken place with the Dobbs decision has kind of undone some of that expectation that we had for 50-some years that this was an okay thing to do. And now, obviously, with the mifepristone issue, the same thing in terms of kind of coming at it from a different angle from the FDA authority to be able to make decisions. So I think the concerns, the confusion, the anxiety that many of the health professionals feel right now is kind of exacerbating probably positions that they hold firmly in terms of their duties and obligations to their patients. And some, obviously, seeing both patients, if you will, the baby, the fetus, as well as the patient, the woman, and all the mess that goes with that. So I think the hope that most healthcare professionals have right now is that the issue related to the FDA would just be settled and go back to the way it was before, so that we can deal with the reality of what we're facing going forward around the issue of whether or not the state's rights are really the best place to play this out. But I think the jury is certainly out on this issue in terms of how we're going to proceed. I think we've been surprised before, and I think most of us are kind of girding our belts to say we might be in for a much longer discussion on this issue. The other thing that I want to distinguish, I think, from terms of kind of the ethical issues versus the legal ones, is that from most ethical perspectives outside of the legal realm, it's really about the individual's practitioners and the principles that guide that individual practitioner's duty to patient, duty of care, the duty of care. The duty of care basically is the primary obligation for the individual practitioners. Norms, societal norms, mores, the rules that we set within the legal spectrum impact that, but we've become accustomed to what those rules were, and having them undone obviously throws things into kind of a bit of a state of confusion. And I think that's the work that we're about now, is to try to figure out, okay, so if this does change and it's for the long term, how does that impact our practice, our ability to perform our duties, our standards of care? If it's throwing everything into that realm, there are a whole lot of professional associations that need to re-examine what it is that their positions are related to these issues.
Thank you. Dr. Madrigal, I want to pose this one to you. What are some of the unforeseen or potentially unintentional, consequences or ways that limiting access to abortion can affect other forms of care that may not be an abortion?
That's a really great point. And the first one in regards to mifepristone is it's commonly discussed in how that impacts termination of pregnancy, but it's also frequently used to manage miscarriage, or spontaneous abortion is the medical term for that. So there's already that implication for patients who need that medicine for that indication. But when we talk about taking abortion off the table, that comes into play not only for complications regarding pregnancy, early rupture of membranes, catastrophic illnesses for the maternal patient that therefore impact the fetal patient, but even things like cancer care. Unfortunately, we've seen, even pre-COVID, but especially post-COVID, how our screening for preventative healthcare has gone down, and we're seeing more and more patients who are finding out they have a cancer diagnosis when they're pregnant because they're showing up for care at that time. And the treatment for cervical cancer, the treatment for breast cancer, the treatment for other cancers, we have a standard of care. And if you take abortion off the table, at least how it's defined in these laws, it means those patients can't get access to care, let alone the standard of care.
David?
I want to jump in on this to support the doctor and expand her position a little bit, because I've done some research and published papers looking at preventive care rates when abortion clinics and women's health clinics close. So the landscape, even before Dobbs, in the last 10 or 15 years in the United States, as many of you are probably aware, has been drastic reductions in abortion access through a whole variety of state laws and policies. And for Planned Parenthood would tell you that for many of these women, this is the only doctor they see in the year. And they're not just going to these clinics for abortion care, they're going for lots of different kinds of contraceptive care and reproductive health care, and are getting a variety of cancer screenings there. So you might be wondering, why is an economist on this panel? And I think there are two different answers to that question. One is economic outcomes as a consequence of these policy changes, which I can get to later in the panel, but also that economics is really a set of tools that we, I think, among all the social sciences, are the one most thinking about when does correlation mean causation? Meaning, you'll never get an institutional review board, nor should you, on a university campus to let you restrict abortion access as part of an experiment to see the consequences of doing so. You can't ethically run that experiment. And therefore, we have to look at observational settings. We have to look at natural experiments to try to understand what's going on and what might go on. And the reductions in access in clinic closures across the country, we parameterize this through changes in driving distance from each zip code or each county to the nearest clinic. And then we look at how that changes and relative changes in preventive care rates. And so my research has shown, and others have shown in Texas, in Wisconsin, in Ohio, that increases in driving distance to the nearest clinic reduce rates of Pap test and professional breast exams and mammograms, which likely will lead to cancer being diagnosed at a later level with worse treatment options.
Thank you. Gloria, I want to ask you, how does this discussion around, medication abortion, mifepristone, how does it relate to other areas of reproductive care, of women's health care? What are your thoughts there?
I probably have the most different thought than everybody here. I actually think abortion as a means of equality is profoundly anti-woman, and I think it asks the wrong questions of society. I think it patterns women's equality as responding in a very male way to that sexual act, that we should be just as unencumbered as men are, when the fact of the matter, there's nothing wrong with a healthy, functioning reproductive system. And I think it doesn't serve women to look at abortion and access to abortion drugs as a means of equality, which is what we often see. And I think it makes us ask the wrong questions. It's time for us to renegotiate the deal. The question isn't, I need these drugs to, or these activities to be free and unencumbered like men. The question should be, what societal structures should be changed to fully accommodate women as we are? So that's really my thoughts, and I think we're asking the wrong things in terms of women's equality, and now's the time to renegotiate the deal.
Thank you. Doug, I want to ask you, you have a regional perspective through your work on the board of Planned Parenthood Great Plains. How do you see this discussion moving forward from Missouri, the states surrounding us, and kind of off of what Gloria said, how is the conversation changing?
Well, I guess I look at it with somewhat of a different perspective, no shock. That to me, it's mostly more a question, and it's something I've been involved with even pre-Planned Parenthood with Missouri Healthcare for All, about healthcare access. So from a Jewish standpoint, I really see there's a concept known as pikuach nefesh, which means sanctity of human life. And I see through stories, both elicited from Planned Parenthood, but beyond that, I've actually got an article with me from the Washington Post about 2 women in Florida who didn't get the care they needed when they needed it and nearly died. And a lot of those stories that I'm just mostly concerned about access to health care, which includes reproductive care.
David, I want to ask, you touched on this a little bit when you last spoke, but I want to hear more about potential economic impacts going forward. And kind of as an aside, do you have any idea of what a marketplace could look like, if we were to lose access to mifepristone? I've, read stories about women, buying pills online and from unreputable sources. Do you have anything to say about that?
Sure, let me start there and then I'll work my way backwards. Generally, most economists favor legalization and regulation over prohibition. On alcohol, on marijuana, on firearms, on all kinds of things where there is a potential negative externality, where there are potential other consequences. Generally, this is a role for the local and state and federal government to ensure that things are safe. That's the role of the FDA. That's one of the roles of the FDA. That's many of the roles of our county health departments. And if something that was previously available is no longer available through normal legitimate means, then you wind up in a situation where individuals access it through less regulated and potentially less safe situations. That's the first one. On the economic outcomes, so I mentioned one way of studying this is by looking at distance to the nearest clinic. Another way of studying this is looking at women who just made or just missed the gestational cutoff for an abortion. I should say, by the way, I want to acknowledge that people who don't identify as women still menstruate and can still have children and still have uteruses. So I'm going to use different things in my language depending on how I'm talking, meaning if I'm speaking generally, I'll do my best to make my language inclusive. If I'm describing a particular study, I want to be consistent with the language in that study so as not to misrepresent it. So the Turnaway study looked at about 1,000 women in abortion clinics across the United States over a couple of years who just made or just missed the gestational cutoff for an abortion. Now, for those of us like me who don't menstruate, let me back up here and explain what I'm talking about. That many abortion procedures can only be done up into a certain number of weeks of gestation. This has been in the news a lot very recently because a lot of states are restricting abortion based on gestational cutoffs. How do we calculate that? It would make sense to calculate that from conception. Unfortunately, conception and ovulation are quite difficult to measure. Menstruation, on the other hand, is actually quite easy to measure and has been quite easy to measure since the dawn of mammals. So we count from the beginning of a last menstrual cycle, even though cycle lengths are different and cycle regularity is different. So if a certain state has a band at 15 weeks, a woman can't walk in and say, well, actually, my cycle is longer, therefore I'm actually less far along. Right? Our laws are not flexible enough from that in the way they're set up. In addition to that, an individual seeking an abortion may need to raise the funds to do so, paying out of pocket, may need to get time off work so the individual doesn't lose that person's job, may need transportation, often needs childcare because the individual already has children, may need a convenient reason to be away from that individual's partner so the partner doesn't know what's about to happen, and then can show up at a clinic and can be too far along or not. So this Turnaway study has many different studies involved. I'll quote some of it later. On the economic front, 2 economists took this data, bought the data on 50,000 other women, sent those 51,000 women's data off to Experian to match to their credit files in an anonymized fashion, got back the anonymized data, and now you can do 2 things that previously weren't possible. You could look at the years before the attempted abortion and see that those individuals actually look the same on their financial situations. And then you can look post the attempted abortion and see that being able to have that abortion drastically improves a household's financial situation versus missing that abortion and having that child. Now, I'm happy to have a conversation about what policy we could do outside of reproductive health care to mitigate that situation, but that's, at the moment, where things are in the United States. That missing a wanted abortion drastically can worsen a household's financial situation for as many years as we can measure. Trying to work with Swedish administrative data so we can look at abortion exceptions 50 years ago and try to paint this much further. Have me back in a couple years, I'll tell you about how it's going. But as of right now, that's the best data that I've seen on this.
Can sure. You know, I'm listening to this, and I have to say, I think it would be terrible public policy to say we need abortion so that people can improve their financial situation or so that they can escape poverty, because I don't believe killing the poor is a solution to poverty. I think what the data is, at least I'd be questioning, is what structures are in place that are making these individual families feel that they cannot support the child that they have. And to me, that's a larger question of what we as a greater community owe to one another, so that the price is not the life of a member of the human family. I just can't sit with that as being an acceptable reason so that someone can be wealthier.
I want to respond in a couple different ways. Sure. One of them is these families are very far from wealth. Mm-hmm. 1. 2, the moderator or somebody can tell me this is outside the bounds of this conversation, but would love to talk about the child tax credit expansion that we did during the pandemic that just ended. Right? One of the most successful policies in American history to reducing child poverty that we are now no longer doing. So there are lots of other policies we can do to improve household financial situations.
I 100% agree with that. And I guess I keep thinking, at least someone that works actively in the Black community with very poor communities, the only person that's removed from the substandard living conditions is the child in the mother's womb. The mother's still living in substandard housing, still is living in a food desert, still has these same health disparities. And so my concern is we're not doing anything to improve the substandard conditions. All we're doing is removing one member of the family from those substandard conditions. And I think that's not serving our community.
John?
Yeah, Gloria, I really resonate with your position, and I want to support it. I guess the question that I continue to come back to is, we know what some of those things are. And we know some of the things that we did over the course of the pandemic that assisted those families and brought children out of poverty in huge, and now we're going backwards. So if in fact the conviction that you hold can be shared generally among the public, and we can create new mechanisms and new, opportunities, there's going to be a price to pay for that. And how do you suggest that I don't see the will there. I see okay, we went through the pandemic, it was holy hell for all of us, we're ready to go back to life as normal. And what I hear you saying is, if we're going to incorporate this new view, this new vision that you have, it is going to require us to make sacrifices that most taxpayers aren't willing to make.
And you know what? I think this is why it is foolish, I think, for us to think for women to have full equality, that it has to be patterned on something that fundamentally asks no radical change of society. And this is the price of our equality. We need to be all in and not make child rearing, pregnancy, mothering so onerous. And if we say we want this equality, it's going to come at a price. We cannot expect to remain the same. And yes, it's going to cost something. And I think we as a society should bear that, rather than saying a member of the human family must die because we refuse to accept women as they are. Our biology is not our enemy. And I think too much of the discussion focuses on the status quo. And yes, we need to make a change. And I think if women start to press for that, I think it's a whole different conversation. I think we do have to have a mind shift, a philosophical shift about what are rights. Rights should never run counter to the nature of a thing. And rights, so-called rights that require us to intentionally cease the natural outcome of sex as it happens in the woman's body, to me just isn't a right. I think it's a cop-out. It's the off-ramp away from the real discussion, the more difficult discussion where people will perhaps be uncomfortable. But if we're wedded to women's rights, I say we need to have that discussion, and we need to expect to have some discomfort because we need to change radically our society.
Doug and then David.
Yeah, just to clarify one point, and it's a little different from an economic consideration, that you're, Gloria, going on an assumption that a fetus is personhood, and in the Jewish world, they don't attain that status of full personhood. In Judaism, one can get an abortion for any reason or no reason at all in the first 40 days, which doesn't buy a lot of time, but it does establish that in the Jewish world, life doesn't begin at conception. And then after that, the health of the mother always takes priority over the fetus right up until the time the baby crowns or something similar to that. So there's just different ways of looking at it, at least from a religious standpoint.
I want to bring in a couple of other economic studies. Studies done by economists in this context. One looks at maternal morbidity through hypertension. One looks at maternal mortality, and one looks at violence against women. And all three of them find reductions in abortion access increase all three of those outcomes. So even if we live in, and I spent a year living in Stockholm, we can talk all about Scandinavian welfare states whenever you all would like, even if we lived in a society that redistributed wealth in a much greater way to really make sure we were taking care of the least fortunate in a way that we do not do in this United States, it would not improve substantially the situation of individuals who are pregnant and miserable while pregnant. And even paid leave, even triple paid leave, right? You can't just go on paid leave while you're pregnant. We'll triple your pay. My understanding, again, as someone who has never been pregnant, for some pregnant individuals, that is still not enough. How do we deal with those situations where pregnancy is on the spectrum from miserable to life-threatening?
Attorney General?
Yeah, I think I'm hearing one potential point of agreement on the panel, and that is that a generous child tax credit is desirable, no matter what your perspective is on this, and no matter what your income is on this. And I say this as the father of 5 children. As you have more kids, it gets more expensive. Surprise, surprise. And whether a person is in a situation where they're contemplating abortion, or whether a person is in a situation of whether contemplating having more children, the expense is something that is a powerful motivator one way or the other. And one of the interesting things, I don't want to get too far off the topic, but one of the interesting things that we across the world are experiencing right now is a demographic winter, because we're about 1.9 replacement rate. 2 is your population stays equal. This is the number of children that a woman may have, and in Europe, some countries are down to 1.3, 1.4, and some countries in Europe have looked at ways to alleviate the financial burden of having children, because it's generally seen as, certainly if we want to maintain Social Security and programs to care for our elderly, that we need to have a more robust birth rate. But it seems like there might be some agreement on a generous child tax credit remaining part of our country's structure.
Dr. Madrigal?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to make that pregnancy is not a health neutral state. It is an incredibly risky state, even for a pregnant patient who is otherwise healthy. And so I think it's a really good point to bring up that is a consideration to take into account. And even if we were to have the very much needed social change that we need to have in many, many areas, that would still remain. And we're seeing, as those social areas continue to be neglected, maternal mortality is going up and up and up. We've seen increases. The latest numbers to come out of 2021 was that we saw a 38% increase in our maternal mortality. And as somebody whose job is to take care of them, it's atrocious. And sometimes it's hard to put percentages into numbers, but that's 1,205 women who died due to a pregnancy-related state. And so I think while all of these changes are much necessary, we can't lose sight of the fact that it is not health neutral, and even if we had all of those supports, this is something that still should be allowed to be a medical decision made by that person. Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess as I'm hearing you speak, is your suggestion that the risk of pregnancy should be addressed by abortion? And I mean, when I'm speaking of abortion, I'm not talking about spontaneous abortion. I'm talking about the intentional stopping of the life of the child in the womb. I'm not talking about the abortion that happens because the child has already died and you need to remove the child's body. I'm talking about those specific, and how, of all the abortions that we have now, is that the majority of the abortions, or are those more the exceptional cases?
The just termination of pregnancy?
No, do you find, because I'm understanding the data differently, but maybe I'm not, that those are the more exceptional cases of the reasons that women seek abortions. It's not because of maybe a threat to the mother's life.
So threats to a maternal life can be in any circumstance. It doesn't have to be, immediate risk of sepsis and death because your membrane's ruptured before viability. We're seeing as a society people being able to get pregnant later in life, and that comes with more hypertension or diabetes or things like that. Also, there's plenty of pregnancy-specific conditions like preeclampsia that can come in a completely healthy person, and so I don't think that a termination of pregnancy is the solution to maternal mortality and morbidity, but I do think that having that discussion with that patient to understand what their personal risks are to pregnancy is an important one. But at the end of the day, abortion is a medical discussion about a medical condition of pregnancy, and my job as a physician is to lay out the facts and for my patient to make the choice that's best for them. And so it is ultimately their decision on what they choose to do with my medical information about that medical state.
Is abortion usually the first line of treatment for things like preeclampsia, or?
So my medical students often laugh, there is no 100 or 0 in medicine. So there is no complete black and white. And so in situations such as preeclampsia, there may be times and patient situations where a termination of pregnancy is what is safest for them. That does not mean they have to choose that. Again, my job and responsibility to them is to give them my medical knowledge and help them make an informed choice. And there's lots of situations where a termination of pregnancy is absolutely not a reasonable option. And there are plenty of situations that kind of come out in our discussions of this where people talk about late-term abortion or, that are just not medical realities. But to sit and be able to give an exact situation for every single thing, I just couldn't, because it's 50 million shades of gray.
So it's not necessarily the only option, is what you're saying, but you'd like it to be an option available for your patients to choose. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, so a termination of pregnancy is an option that should be available for patients.
So I want to bring one more piece of this, which is I spoke earlier about why prohibition generally is not a great policy, and legalization and regulation is generally a much safer policy. And many of you may have seen the article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about 5 women who almost died because they couldn't receive abortions in Texas, suing Texas, not to restore the right to abortion as before, but just to clarify what the protocols are about when a mother's life is in danger. Because the situation we're in now is a patient is in a horrible situation, and the provider says, do I want to risk my own personal freedom and the livelihood of my family to do what I think is best to save the person in front of me's life? And we're at a situation where legislating from the judicial branch, as opposed to legislating from the legislative branch, has resulted in lack of clarity in healthcare, for which more people are going to die and more people are going to be sick because we can't implement healthcare the way that our providers would want to.
And that's the duty of care problem, is that if you don't know what you can do, and you've invested $1 gazillion in your education, you're going to, in many cases, take the safer route, which is, I don't want to get charged with a crime. And so you'll find that there are many physicians and others in the profession who are saying, we need clarity so that we know what we can do. Back to your point, it's got to be clearer than it is right now. And the assumption that we're going to get 50 states to agree is far from reality right now.
Just to add one more quick thing on that, which is that many of you who have friends in medical school know that residency match just happened. And actually the association that runs that put out a report looking at who chose OBGYN and who chose it in what states. And we're all brave to be up here, but none of us is entering residency right now. That across the country, fewer medical students want to be OBGYNs, and that number is even lower in states that have the strictest bans on abortion.
I think we're going to jump to some questions and some fact checks, so let's take a pause for that.
We have 3 questions. The first question is from a University Academy student. If the word privacy is not in the Constitution, then will the case of Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965 be reversed as well?
Attorney General, do you have anything for that?
That is a very astute question, yeah, because the Griswold v. Connecticut, which was a contraception case from the mid-1960s, was the kind of foundation on which Roe versus Wade was built. And privacy is not in the Constitution in terms of the word privacy. It does, but the conclusion that the questioner suggests that Griswold might be overturned, I think there's less likelihood of that because the right at issue in Griswold was so the way the court looks at it. There's the things that are written in the Constitution. And when I say the court, I'm talking about the U.S. Supreme Court, and this is true regardless if you're talking about the Supreme Court of the 70s versus the Supreme Court of today. But if a right is written in the Constitution, then the court says, well, obviously that's a fundamental right, and those are the super rights that have this elevated protection. If a right is not written in the Constitution, then the court is very cautious to list that as a right they categorize it under the word liberty in the 14th Amendment. And that's what the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision did in 1992. The Supreme Court kind of recognized that Roe versus Wade was not particularly well reasoned, and they said, well, we're not basing this in an unnamed privacy right. We're moving the abortion right into the liberty category under the 14th Amendment. And so back to the question, I think the Griswold decision, the question of contraception, would be evaluated under the liberty standard in the 14th Amendment, and I think it would stand a better chance of being recognized as a historically recognized fundamental right, and there's a whole line of precedents that the Supreme Court looks at. As a practical matter, I don't think Griswold will ever be revisited. In fact, the Griswold case itself was a manufactured case by some Yale law professors, and I learned the whole story from one of my Yale law professors when I was a student at Yale Law School. They wanted to create the case so they sort of engineered an arrest that wasn't really going to happen otherwise so that they could test the notion of whether there was a fundamental constitutional right to contraception. And they took a Connecticut law that hadn't been enforced for decades, and I'm not aware of any state laws that could even be used to test Griswold again. So as a practical matter, no, Griswold will not be revisited. And as a constitutional matter, if it ever were revisited, I think the court would approach it differently because of the way they address liberty interests under the 14th Amendment.
Thank you.
Our next question is for Ms. Purvis. Some women want to have an abortion and don't want to feel pressured. Do you think that women should have that right?
I think the question should be, why does that woman want to have an abortion? And what structures in her life have failed her that she feels that going forth with the natural functioning of her body is unacceptable. So I really think it has to be, well, why does she want the abortion? And what are we doing to address the structures that make her feel like she must choose an abortion?
But does that matter of, I'm assuming your convenience for the part of the woman also apply to the fact that she could even get pregnant?
Say that again?
So is contraception included in that same area of choice about what's failed her in terms of her being able to do that?
So I do think failed contraception does make a woman think your only other choice is to abort. But I think we recognize that, I mean, if you read any packages, they'll tell you that artificial contraception is not 100%. And we take on that risk when we still engage in sexual activity, knowing that one of the risks is that we get pregnant. And I don't think, practically speaking, abortion, to me, is a solution to failed contraception. And we understand that a new life, a new being, a new member of the human family, I understand some people won't say it's a person, a new member of the human family is a natural outcome of the sexual act. And I don't think abortion should be recourse for failed contraception, because I don't think it solves anything other than, again, instilling the idea that our biology as females is the enemy of our progress. So that's just my thoughts on it.
So just to talk about contraception a little more for a minute, just because no contraception is perfect doesn't mean we can't get better at contraception as a society.
Right, I didn't argue against that.
Okay. Because I think there are both scientific pieces and public policies and funding that can improve contraception, and steps we're not taking that we could be taking.
Another question?
Okay, our last question for right now is, I'm concerned about the precedent of removing FDA approval of mifepristone. There are many drugs that may cause fetal harm, so are those now subject to disapproval?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, I'm concerned about the precedent of removing FDA approval of mifepristone. There are many drugs that may cause fetal harm, so are those drugs now subject to disapproval?
I don't think that was the reason why they objected to mifepristone in the original objection back in 2002, by the way, to the way the drug was approved, but maybe you could speak more to that.
Yeah, and so to answer the question, I think the FDA the ruling on the FDA case, the mifepristone case, when it finally comes down from the Supreme Court, which it will inevitably get there, won't necessarily establish a precedent that would have a direct impact on other pregnancy or abortion-related drugs, because these FDA cases are super fact-specific, or as we say in the law, they're fact-bound. It's going to be very hard to take that ruling and apply it to another drug just because that drug is related to the abortion area or to pregnancy in some way. So I don't think it will necessarily lead to if the FDA ruling were overturned by the courts, it would lead to a domino effect. The other thing I would say is there was some discussion earlier about the unpredictability, and here mifepristone's been around for 20 years since it was approved in I think it was 2002. One of the interesting things about that, though, that you wouldn't know unless you're a lawyer who's been following this particular issue, is the FDA. There were attempts to any FDA decision is subject to legal challenge, right? And you can have a judicial review of that decision, but the FDA kept pushing back and saying, no, the case is not ripe. The case is under the Administrative Procedure Act. There's a way for any agency to say, no, you can't review our decision yet because it's not a final agency decision. And so the FDA kept kicking the can down the road, said, nope, can't review it yet, until finally this year it was subject to review. So that legal tactic by the FDA has delayed the judicial review, and that's why the 20-year uncertainty now has resulted, because of lawyers doing what lawyers do, and that is, trying to find some avenue to push off a decision.
Doug, did you have anything to add there?
No, I guess a question. Over those 20 years, and I don't have the statistics, but what are the statistics on the drug in terms of any harmful side effects, cause of death, those kinds of issues? I mean, notwithstanding what attorneys do, there should be a track record of how effective the drug is and or how harmful the drug is.
Well, part of when you read the decision, that was part of the complaint, is that the FDA changed certain things that could be reported. And so I'm not sure, at least as I understood when I was reading what came from that judge, is that that's part of the issue, is that the FDA disallowed certain things from being tracked and reported. So that, how do we know?
Wasn't during the COVID, the last 3 years, there was a lot of study done on mifepristone related to women reporting without having a doctor's visit face-to-face, and the efficacy of the drug was, in terms of dosing, was diminished, and they still found the efficacy was. So if you're reducing risk by the fact that you're taking a lower dose and still being as effective in terms of the treatment, it seems to me that it's kind of the next step in the process of validating the reliability of the medication in the first place. Maybe Dr.
Well, I don't have the exact studies and the exact data, but it for 20 years, we have post-marketing essentially data that it has been safe. And my personal qualm with this is that a lot is being shown or made of what was or wasn't reported to the FDA or what was withheld. this is not exclusive to this drug, and yet we're talking exclusively about this drug that has been shown in use for the last 2 decades to be safe in and of itself, but also to make medical management, medication-specific management of both termination of pregnancy or miscarriage to be safer in the sense that it has fewer complications that require follow-up. Not necessarily life-threatening, but fewer just in general complications. And so I would love the fact checkers if they have that. I don't have those numbers in and of itself, but from the data that we do have, it's exceptionally safe. Like, you know, the buzz quote is that it's safer than Tylenol, but for the data we have, it is. It's 2 in 100,000 versus 4 in 100,000. So I hear it, but why again is this the only thing that we're talking about? There's so many other medications that we could have that same conversation. It feels targeted.
But don't we? I mean, the FDA's had to pull drugs off of the market that have been out there for a long time before. Yeah, no?
There's a lot, but at the same time, also suddenly now we have this FDA on a pedestal when all of our vitamins are not FDA approved. The medicines that I use pretty routinely that are shown safe through studies and studies and studies, you know, are FDA approved for other indications, but we use that's part of medicine as well, where you look at the scientific evidence and the studies done for the safety effect, and the FDA is there as well, but there's plenty of, you know, medications that are used for alternative things. It doesn't mean that they're not safe. It's just not what the FDA approved them for.
No, I meant specifically things that were once FDA approved that they had to withdraw from the market because the FDA says they're no longer safe.
Sure,
right?
that absolutely
Right.
happens. That doesn't mean there's medicines that are out there that shouldn't be subject to the same sort of questioning if this is the line of questioning that we're taking.
And I should hope they are. I should hope that we still ask the questions about new medicines that are released. What kind of harm people experience, and that we report that. I thought that was just still a part of just the process with any new medicine that's released.
I wouldn't be able to answer that, but it's not a perfect system, as nothing is.
Attorney General, I want to come to you. I am curious why you are having the state Supreme Court revisit the rule that protects right to an abortion in the state constitution after the vote in August.
So the court wasn't revisiting it. What the court, there was she's referring to a oral argument that was held at the end of March, and this was the case in chief, the final ruling on a case that started in 2018, I believe. And the case went up to the Supreme Court on a preliminary injunction question. The Supreme Court Kansas Supreme Court in 2019 said that, in many ways very similar to Roe, the Supreme Court of Kansas said, well, even though the abortion right isn't expressly talked about in the Kansas Constitution, we are going to read or infer a right to an abortion in the Kansas Constitution based on the word liberty. Again, similar to Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And even though the framers of the Kansas Constitution didn't talk about it, and the people of Kansas, when they voted it to ratify that Constitution, didn't know that was part of it, we're still going to find it there. So anyway, then the case went back down to the lower courts and worked its way back up to the Supreme Court on the final, not on the preliminary injunction, but on the final ruling, and that's what was argued. So it wasn't a question of us re-raising the issue. It was already there, and in fact, when I came in as Attorney General on January 9th, the oral argument was scheduled for just a few weeks after I came in, and so we asked the court for a couple of months delay so that our team could, quickly get up to speed and argue the case that had been briefed by the prior Attorney General. Anyway, so that's why the Kansas Supreme Court is addressing that question. And, in Kansas, because of that 2019 ruling by the Supreme Court that there is a state constitutional right, you are going to see continued litigation. There's another case that's working its way up through, and that's concerning the very interesting question of telemedicine abortion, or abortion where the doctor is not present. And I think that might be an area where there's maybe more agreement in the room that I personally believe, not as I'm not speaking as an attorney, but just as a person, that a doctor should be present if there is going to be abortion legal in any state. But that case is working its way up, challenging right now Kansas law does require that a doctor be present with the administration of any abortion-causing pill or any abortion procedure. And so that will work its way up to the courts. So there will continue to be litigation on these details in Kansas.
Thank you.
Can I get some clarification from Megan? The discussion that took place earlier. Mifepristone does not actually cause the abortion.
Yeah, no. So what mifepristone is try not get too sciencey.
Go full sciencey. Come on, we're okay here.
So what mifepristone is it kind of primes the uterus to respond better to the second medication. So there's receptors on the uterus that progesterone binds, the mifepristone binds there and sort of prevents the progesterone from acting there, which allows the second medicine, the misoprostol, to be better at its job, which is how it contributes to decrease complications, because the medications work more effectively to have less bleeding or less need for follow-up procedures, things like that. So the mifepristone itself, correct, is just kind of like a priming agent.
Does it stop the child from growing, the mifepristone?
Mm-mm.
Okay,
it just blocks the progesterone from acting on the uterus.
Makes the uterus inhospitable.
Right, that's what I'm saying. And they have to be attached to the uterus, no?
It doesn't make it inhospitable. What it allows is for the mechanism of the second medicine, which is a prostaglandin, to have the uterus respond to it more. But no, it's not disrupting anything in the gestation.
So when does the
passage?
Well, when is the death? When is the death in the womb?
So,
I don't know what else to say, and you have something living that we're trying to make unalive. I don't know how else to say it. I'm just...
Dr. Madrigal.
I don't know how else to say it.
Okay.
I don't know how else. Yeah, she said
Dr. Madrigal.
Oh, sure.
You can respond.
So I would say there is no way. I think what you're referring to is when the cardiac activity stops. There's no way to know that because you would, depending on your gestational age, there's not even a cardiac tube at that point forming. But what most likely happens is whatever you want to call it, death or passage of the pregnancy, occurs all at once.
During the first pill or the second pill?
Second.
Okay. The other question I think I had was around contraception. We know that the woman's body is not fertile all the time, and the man's body is. Has there been any real progress on dealing with
male contraception?
Yeah, and why is that not?
Right here.
I love it. Vasectomies are wonderful.
Well,
No,
I mean
I
even
got a
like
better
a
one.
pill. I mean even like.
No. So can I jump?
Yeah.
So there's been technology in India that's been like 5 years away for 15 years. That basically instead of severing the vas deferens and cauterizing it, you can inject a polymer that shears the sperm as it would go through, that can then be reversed, injecting, I think, citric acid. So this has been under development for a very long time. There was a new round of funding last month by an American company, and they've chosen the name Plan A for this product. So I think a question as an economist I would ask the panel is, where's Operation Warp Speed for Plan A? Meaning, where as a country are we going to say that we want everybody involved in contraception, and we want to split the burden and reframe the table and turn the table over? And I'm forgetting your metaphor, but where is the conversation on that to make this a burden or make this a responsibility that everybody who's fertile in a heterosexual relationship owns?
Well, what have the studies said about men taking pills for this? My understanding is that it has been males do not, will not do this?
The hope is that this, which is not hormonal, which should have zero hormonal or emotional or psychological consequences, the hope is that more men will be willing, and I guess more individuals, sperm-producing individuals, will be willing to take this. But we'll see.
So I don't have a perfect answer to that, but I would say the preliminary data coming out so far post-Dobbs is that there is an increase in people seeking vasectomies. So I think more of the question is we don't have the options for those people to access, and the one that they do have, vasectomy, which just despite all the shearing and cutting and stuff, is a very safe and painless procedure, is that I think, to your point, as a society, we haven't really questioned what our status quo was, and that this often fell on the female patient as the issue to address, and that post-Dobbs, it's become more of a conversation of who in this relationship where pregnancy can occur is responsible for the contraception if a pregnancy is not desired. But the short answer is vasectomy pursual and completion has gone up since Dobbs. I apologize, I don't have exact numbers.
You can see it in the Google Trends data.
So let me just add another point of clarification on my thoughts, actually, is that I'm not suggesting that we artificially, make people sterile. I do think, though, that we need to think differently about sex and its natural outcomes and not see that as fundamentally an injustice to the man or the woman. And so I think that we would have different conversations around sex in child rearing than what we're having now. And I'm not suggesting that artificial contraception does anything to change the mindset around people's attitudes or understandings of sex and the natural outcome being another person, child, being, whatever you want to say, another member of the human family. So just being clear on that.
I think we have another question, fact check.
Okay, this round we have 4 questions and 1 fact checked. The first question is, in 2022, nearly 20,000 women's health nurses left the workforce. How do you propose we recruit and retain a nursing workforce who potentially fear criminal liability for providing access to abortion care?
Does anyone have immediate thoughts?
2, one I think I said earlier, which is we need to clarify what each state, I think, needs to clarify what is permissible under that state's laws and what is not, and needs to commit to not holding providers legally responsible when they putting legal consequences on providers when they follow the guidelines. And moving that into an administrative setting, I think we need that. The other one, just to be an economist for a second, is pay them more. Any labor shortage can be solved by paying people more.
Anyone else?
Well,
have
actually,
thoughts? John?
the nursing shortage is much more complicated than that. I mean,
pay them more than that.
Well, there's a whole bunch of other
No, but there's the teaching profession for nurses is most of those are women, and most of them are retiring, and we don't have the numbers that we need in order to increase the student population at the traditional age to get them in there. I mean, it's a huge issue in terms of what we need to be doing in terms of addressing that population. And there's tons of material out there, but I'm not sure that just paying more is going to solve the problem, certainly in the next few years.
The next question is, why are we educating our young women about their bodies and reproductive systems and bringing more awareness to PCOS and other medical issues that don't have as much recognition?
Say that again?
Very good. Why are we educating young women about their bodies and reproductive systems and bringing more awareness to PCOS and other medical issues that aren't receiving as much recognition?
As much recognition as what?
I'm assuming abortion and like these big topics and just educating the women and people.
Dr. Madrigal?
I don't know. I think that could be a whole nother panel about education and sexual health education and healthcare access, to come talk to your friendly neighborhood gynecologist about all of that. I don't have an easy answer for that. I'm really sorry. I think it's absolutely something that we should be doing. I think, if anything, the last year has been incredibly eye-opening for myself personally about where our kind of common base knowledge of healthcare and reproductive healthcare in particular is. And as somebody whose job is that for a living, it's very easy to lose sight of like how sequestered I am. So it's something that I think should be an incredibly big part of what we pursue, but I don't know why it is the way it is now.
Well, but don't you, I would think when you position abortion as fundamental to a woman's equality and rights, it takes on a different level of importance versus PCOS. You know, having PCOS, people aren't going to argue that if you have PCOS, it limits your right to, limits your equality, in the same way that people will say if you don't have access to an abortion, it limits your equality. So I think there's just a heavier emphasis on abortion because it's so heavily tied with women's equality.
On education of abortion?
No, well, yeah, I think when we talk about women's equality, abortion takes a higher, I don't think anyone thinks that PCOS limits your equality in the way that
I'm so sorry. So,
polycystic ovarian syndrome.
Polycystic ovarian syndrome, often found in women of reproductive age, painful cysts on ovaries. It can intervene with reproductive health down the line, fertility, those sorts of things.
Periods.
Next question.
Anti-abortion policies are often supported by faith groups and or rooted in faith-based arguments. Shouldn't we treat abortion as a religious issue, and such shouldn't it not be regulated by the states? What about separation of church and state?
I think, okay, let me just stop whoever asked that question. That's absolutely false. There's so many groups that do not support abortion that are led by atheists or people of no faith whatsoever. I can name them. You've got Feminists for Life, you've got New Wave Feminists, you've got Progressive Anti-Abortion Uprising, you've got Rehumanize International, you've got Secular Pro-Life. There's so many groups that oppose abortion, not from any religious basis at all. And you don't have to have a religious basis to oppose abortion. So I think that's kind of a false framing of who supports abortion or does not support abortion.
So I'm one of 14 clergy plaintiffs suing the state of Missouri on their abortion ban legislation. And the suit is coming under the Establishment Clause of the Missouri Constitution, which says the state cannot establish a singular religious view, and it comes up in a variety of circumstances in terms of us as taxpayers, of places of worship, of so on and so forth. And in pursuing the lawsuit, the attorneys have uncovered the floor debate on the legislation, and those who supported the ban to a person cited their religion as the means by which they needed to put forth, advocate for a ban on abortion. And when you get past the floor legislation, when you go back to what they said on the campaign trail, so much the more so. So for whatever organizations that are atheists that support or are anti-abortion, what's coming up in state legislatures is full-throated religious reasoning for banning abortion.
Attorney General, I saw your hand there.
Yeah. So this is an issue where obviously there are religious motivations and religious beliefs that underlie many people's opposition to abortion. But I don't think you can, I don't think that the argument that it is tantamount to the establishment of religion will fare well in court. Because what establishment means historically is something very different, both at the federal level and at the state level. But back to the point about abortion, you can have no religious faith whatsoever, but if you believe that the unborn fetus is a person, and that person's life is being terminated, then a person can have an ethical objection to abortion purely on that basis alone. So it is absolutely true that many people who are pro-life, including myself, have a religious faith that may underlie, and in my case does underlie my beliefs, but it is not true to assert that all opposition to abortion is based on religion.
The issue of personhood is extremely complicated and difficult to argue holistically all the way through. So even, identical twins. So is that one soul or two souls? When does ensoulment happen? All those kinds of issues that come up in religious arguments in terms of the issue of personhood is extremely complicated, and in my review of it is fraught. It doesn't hold out in the long term in terms of what you're trying to propose, which is, I'm also of a belief that human life is sacred, but a human person and human life, for many people, are two different things. And so a blastocyst or a zygote is not a person. It's human tissue. It's human. And it may have electrical impulses that at some point when it gets into the womb and can become a fetus and a baby is one thing. But when does that happen? The moment of conception, I got a lot of questions about conception being the place for that to.
Yeah, and specifically to that, in Judaism, the idea of when a soul is imbued versus when a fetus attains some sense of personhood are two different things. So the idea of soul doesn't play into it. And what I'll say is this: look, when I talk about Jewish law, I'm not here to advocate that everybody follow Jewish law. And if you look at the lawsuit, amongst all the clergy plaintiffs, we all come at this from a different perspective. Even amongst the 5 rabbis included in the 14 clergy plaintiffs, we have slightly different views, but agree that it shouldn't be a one singular religious view that pushes forward abortion bans as part of government legislation.
I guess just in terms of the whole, I know that at the moment of conception, there's something in there that's self-directed and grows without, it has its own self-directed development. Whether you consider that a person or not, fine. But to me, it is a member of the human family. And as someone who is a descendant of people whose personhood was once questioned, I tend to feel like I can side with the blastocysts here, because there are at times that people doubted our humanity and our personhood and our rights and things like that. So I'm very confident that what's growing in the womb of an adult human female is human. It is alive. Otherwise, we wouldn't be trying to stop it. And it, as a matter of that fact, as being a member of the human family in those terms, its life, I think, has to be worthy of some consideration.
Dr. Madrigal, and then our next question.
Very quick, just on that, for the medical perspective of fertilization and conception, just because again we talked about reproductive health is not our strongest suit. That happens when a sperm meets the egg in the fallopian tube. It has not implanted in the uterus yet. And so, wherever, as we've said, each person's definition is different, but that conception happens in the tube. That zygote, as it divides, moves through the tube to go to the uterus. It may or may not implant. And so that's something to just keep in mind, that if that is your own personal definition of where it begins, that those in and of themselves don't always implant and could just be a heavier period. Yep. Just for the medical side.
Next question.
While tax credits and other societal policies would be undeniably helpful, what would you say to a pregnant woman in the current state, that cannot financially support another child?
I want to make sure I understand the question. What would you say to pregnant women in states that do not support abortion? What would you say to pregnant women who cannot financially support a child?
Yes, they cannot financially support a child.
Oh, I have that conversation all the time. Here are some resources. Let me help you. Let me introduce you to a number of resources that are available to help you with this difficult pregnancy. Everything that's available to pregnant women isn't necessarily governmental. If the government is short on things, there are things called charities that are more than willing to help women with housing, material support, friendship, doctor's care, all of that.
Doug?
I'm going back to what David pointed to earlier in statistics, that's not meeting the need at this point. And what do we do in the meantime?
And we have a fact check.
So we have this fact check in regarding to the safety of mifepristone. So according to New York Times, in addition to it being safer than Tylenol, it has a serious medical complication rate of 0.31% in comparison to the serious complication rate of childbirth, which is 1.4%. So it is both safer than Tylenol and than childbirth.
And just to teach you all another economics term, which is relevant counterfactual, which is, I think, what the New York Times is saying without using professor language, is that the alternative to taking it is carrying the child to term, not being pregnant and not taking it. Right? That's the two forks in the road are attempt to carry the child to term or take this drug. I think what the New York Times is saying is the relevant counterfactual is riskier to the woman's life than taking this drug.
Dr. Madrigal, I want to jump to you. We had a short period here in Missouri over the summer after the reversal of Roe where providers were unsure what sorts of care they could provide, and we've heard this come up already in the discussion. Providers are also finding themselves in the middle of legal limbo while cases are being discussed in the courts. How, as a provider, does that sort of scenario affect the care that you can provide?
Really great question. Last June was incredibly difficult for what's been said, the uncertainty. So on the handout, you guys actually have the wording from the law, which despite having so many words and feeling like it should cover all of your bases, as soon as it went into effect, we had gray areas. Because from our side, for example, an easy example is ectopic pregnancy, which is a pregnancy growing anywhere but the uterus. All it can do is grow big enough to rupture and cause the pregnant patient to bleed potentially to death. And so the question, one of the immediate questions was, if I think she has an ectopic, can I treat that because I know it will eventually impact her life, or do I have to wait until they start bleeding? And if they've started bleeding, do I have to wait until she's unstable? And so despite there being what felt like, I'm sure in the lawmakers' minds, enough to be incredibly clear, as we've said, all of this healthcare, and honestly healthcare in general, is just 50 million shades of gray. And so the uncertainty, and then to add to the fact that in regards to the Missouri law, if you're found in violation of this, going through court and they've found you guilty and all that stuff, the penalty is a Class B felony, which is 5 to 15 years in prison, no less than 5. And so what you had was exactly as what's been talked about, people who have signed up for a job, a profession, a passion, a vocation, whatever you want to call it, to keep their patients safe and to give them the best care that they can, now wondering if they could do that. And so it was incredibly uncertain. And you saw, if anybody remembers, like the news at the time, different hospitals saying different things, and your doctor's office might have said something else. And that was all because each individual legal team was trying to figure out what they thought they could legally protect you for. And it no longer became about what is medically in your best interest, but what can I legally offer you? It was an incredibly difficult month, or time still.
Believe it or not, we are at time. I've still got about 3 pages of questions, but we'll have to address it at another time. So, as we do with all American Public Square events, as we end them, we ask the question, so what, now what? We're going to go down the line here. Everyone can respond. Whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll start. First of all, I want to commend the students. This is the kind of dialogue that we need to be having not only in forums like this, but with our legislators, who in many cases are very well intended in terms of the efforts that they're trying to pursue in terms of their constituents, but come at it with, I guess, a hammer rather than the nuanced approach that we need. And I just would, in terms of so what, I think those of us that have participated in this owe it to ourselves and to those that we love to continue this conversation in terms of being able to resolve the issues, and from my perspective, especially for the health professions. I mean, we cannot subject them to the kind of uncertainty and risks that they shouldn't be having to face related to their duty of care, which is really what they're in the business to do. So.
One thing I would say is something that Alexis de Tocqueville said in the 1830s when he was studying American culture, and it's as true now as it was 190 years ago. He said, "There's hardly any political question in the United States that sooner or later does not turn into a judicial question." We are a very litigious society, and so these areas of uncertainty that we've been talking about, like what is the medical emergency under the Missouri law, what is a life of the mother situation under the Texas law, those will be litigated. And eventually, slowly, unfortunately, not quickly, but slowly, the wheels of justice will grind, and eventually the courts will start giving more specific answers than the statute provides. So it's never a great thing to say, well, there'll be lawsuits and we'll figure it out, but the clarity will eventually come through our litigious system.
Go for it.
So I am disappointed in our legal system from specific comments from the Supreme Court about what information they did and didn't consider. So I was one of 154 economists who signed a brief to the Supreme Court in the Dobbs case. And when that brief came up in oral arguments, the Chief Justice's response was putting the data aside. And when the leaked decision from Justice Alito, which then multiply became the final decision, Justice Alito wrote that it's hard for anyone, in particular a court, to assess, namely, the effect of abortion right on society, in particular on the lives of women. And the New Yorker article about this, quoting my friend Professor Caitlin Myers, said, I think we need the data, and we have it, and we gave it to them, and it just seems not to be reflected in that draft. So my hope is that our judicial system will read the briefs that are filed and listen to the experts, including the non-lawyer experts, who are helping them understand all of the consequences of their actions, which they now own, having put down decisions that have those consequences.
Rabbi, Dr. Madrigal?
What I would hope that we could do is work to expand our healthcare coverage, to get that fundamental access to healthcare in general, but any type of healthcare that impacts this discussion. So, if you live on the Kansas side, the expansion of Medicaid. If you live on the Missouri side, the expansion to cover postpartum Medicaid for up to a year. I encourage doing things like this to get more reputable information. There's so much out there that just isn't true or is misjudged or misguided. So having these conversations is wonderful. And I would say this topic has so much conversation about it that is personal opinion and personal stance, when really this topic is anything but that. It's a medical issue. And the only place for a personal opinion is for that one person's pregnancy. And I hope we work towards that.
So the so what part, I admit that I didn't completely understand where it was going when it was first presented to us, but now I kind of see it. And the so what is that these incredible students chose this for a topic, that you're all here and everybody's feeling pretty passionately about this, and see, regardless of what side you land on, how important this issue is. And it also reinforced for me tonight, kind of getting to the now what, is two things that I think need to happen. One is to really give agency to women in making their own decisions about their health care in consultation with healthcare providers, which leads me to the other piece, which is the need to uplift our healthcare providers and honor them for the work they do and the passion and the compassion they bring into the space. I've referenced Jewish law from time to time, and one piece of Jewish law is back in the day, in the rabbinic period, you couldn't be in a community unless they had a doctor in the community. So, you know, my job as clergy who counsels congregants, including on issues regarding abortion, is to honor the healthcare providers with whom they consult and just be a guide in that direction. So,
Gloria?
I've been thinking about this. I really think we need to break the framing that positions women's equality and empowerment and freedom on basically ending the life of the member of the human family that's in her womb. I'm trying to use the language that everybody can agree to here. And I think we're asking the wrong questions. We're not asking enough for the structures in society that I think do oppress women. And I don't think we're going to reach that equality as long as we keep taking the off-ramp for abortion to be the solution to our economic challenges, difficult lives, et cetera, rather than really challenging the fundamental way in which we move about in society. So what does it look like to be a high school student that is pregnant or mothering? Does the school provide the right supports for you to actually finish your education? Same for university. What does it look like in education, the military, so on and so forth? What could our world look like that fully accepts women as we are and does not treat our asymmetrical response to sex as the problem? So that's what I'd like you to start dreaming and thinking about.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. And that concludes our night. So I'm going to hand it over to APS Executive Director Claire Bishop for some closing remarks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Meg. And we're going to keep this quick. I'd ask everyone to keep their seats until we conclude the program. For those of you I've not yet met, my name is Claire Bishop. I'm Executive Director at American Public Square at Jewel. I also get the dubious distinction of making a couple of brief remarks before we have a few of our students come up and close the program this evening. First, I'd like to express special appreciation to the generous funders who have provided support for the Civics Education Initiative, for which tonight's program is the culminating event of the school year. I'd like to thank our moderator, Meg Cunningham, as well as each of our panelists for sharing their perspectives this evening. This has been a really rich and robust conversation. Special thanks also to our roving reporter, Hannah Wise, our fact checker, Kate Noland, and of course, to our incredible teachers and student ambassadors who planned and produced this event. Would you give them all a round of applause as well? I want to thank our APS team, our staff, an incredible group of individuals who have tired to endlessly to make this event happen, and I want to recognize one individual in particular. Tricia Maxfield, American Public Square's Civics Education Program Leader, has poured her heart and soul into the support of the teachers and educators who have produced this program tonight. She's also put a good amount of blood, sweat, and tears into that effort as well, and I just want to give her a special recognition because without her, this would not be possible, and she deserves, in and of herself, a round of applause. Congratulations, Tricia. It's almost over, and you did it. Couple quick remarks. Tomorrow you will receive an email with a link to a short post-event survey. We ask that you complete that if you are able. It helps us to plan future programs, so look out for that in an upcoming email. And I ask you to consider joining us for upcoming events. You can learn more at our website, americanpublicsquare.org. With that, I'm done. I'm going to hand it over to our students for brief closing remarks. Thank you.
On behalf of American Public Square, we would like to present our moderator and each of our panelists with an engraved civility bell. We hope that these come in handy as you seek to engage in civil, fact-based conversations at home, at work, and in the community.
Well, they're supposed to be handing out bags, but I'll just go ahead and go. We would like to leave everyone with this final thought. The following is a quote from the book The Big Sort by Bill Bishop and Robert Cushing. In a country that is divided by economic prospects, by years of education, by the look and feel of what constitutes a family, and by political persuasion, we continue to believe there might be a more important message we all need to hear.
The message people living in a democracy must understand, more than any other message, is that there are Americans who aren't just like you. They don't live like you, they don't have families like yours, and they don't think just like you. They may not live in your neighborhood, but this is their country too.
Thank you all so much for coming, and good night.